In the spring of 1942, Paris had grown colder, not from the weather, but from the silence that followed every knock on a door. The German occupation was tightening its grip, and every Jewish family in the city lived under a fog of fear. In a narrow apartment on Rue de Gencourt, the Rosenfeld family sat huddled around a wooden table, sharing a quiet dinner of stale bread and watery soup. Emil Rosenfeld, barely 6 years old, clutched his stuffed bear to his chest. He didn't understand why the curtains were always drawn, why his father whispered now, or why his mother cried after every visit to the market. To him, the world outside was a puzzle of hushed footsteps and strange uniforms. But inside their tiny home, warmth still flickered in his mother's lullabies, in his father's bedtime stories, and in the soft, clumsy kisses of his older sister, Judith. That night, Henry Rosenfeld leaned close to his wife, Miriam, and whispered, "They came for the levies last night. It's time. We can't wait any longer." Miriam's face went pale. Her fingers tightened around Emil's shoulder. "We leave tomorrow," Henry said, quietly resolute. "I've arranged passage to Lyon. From there, we'll find a way to Switzerland." Switzerland. It sounded like a dream. Henry had once crossed its border as a boy, during a summer long forgotten. Now it represented not beauty, but safety, the last glimmer of hope. The next day, the Rosenfelds packed only what they could carry: 2 satchels, a blanket, a family photo tucked into Miriam's coat, and Emil's beloved bear. They left their home in silence, slipping into the cold dawn with hearts pounding like war drums. Their contact, a man named Augustin, waited in a wagon outside the city. He drove them south under the guise of transporting firewood, hiding the family beneath heavy canvas. For days, they traveled by night, switching routes, dodging checkpoints, feeding Emil and Judith bits of apple to keep them quiet. But just miles from the safe house near Lyon, disaster struck. A German patrol intercepted the wagon. In the confusion, gunshots rang out. Augustin fell, and the Rosenfelds scattered. Miriam clung to Emil, running into the woods while Henry disappeared with Judith in the other direction. A soldier shouted, and Miriam pushed Emil behind a fallen log. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No matter what you hear." Then she stood, hands raised. "I have nothing," she pleaded in broken German. The soldier yelled again, and Emil saw his mother vanish into the fog, her silhouette swallowed by the trees. He waited, for hours, then days. When rescuers from a resistance group found him, Emil was alone, feverish and silent. He would never speak of what he saw that night. He was passed from one safe house to another, eventually brought to a Catholic orphanage near the border. There, his name was changed, his faith rewritten, his past buried like a ghost. The Rosenfelds became just another story swallowed by war, until decades later, when a stranger in Pennsylvania opened a worn leather album and found a boy's name written in Hebrew, next to a photo of a child clutching a bear. Emil Rosenfeld. A name long lost to silence, a memory that refused to stay buried. The orphanage in Chambéry stood tall and cold, against the rolling hills of southeastern France, a former monastery turned shelter. Its stone walls echoed with the muffled cries of war orphans, children whose names had been lost, rewritten, or forgotten. Emil Rosenfeld, now listed as Marc Renault, arrived in silence. He was thin, pale, and wide-eyed, clutching the tattered bear that had survived with him. The sisters, dressed in their somber habits, took him in without question. Children arrived every week, some delivered by resistance fighters, others found alone in forests or along empty roads. Sister Agath, a stern yet gentle woman, knelt before him. "What is your name, Petty?" Emil didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because something inside him had curled up and closed. Instead, he held the bear forward, as if the toy might speak for him. The sisters called him Mark from that day forward. His days were structured, quiet. Mornings began with prayer. Lessons followed in Latin, French, and scripture. The orphans were fed simply: boiled grains, thin soups, a rare piece of fruit on feast days. In the evenings, they sang hymns in the chapel, the candlelight flickering over faces too young to carry such sorrow. Mark rarely spoke, but he listened, he watched. At night, he whispered to his bear, recounting dreams he couldn't understand and memories that didn't quite belong. He dreamt often of a woman with braids who smelled of cinnamon, of a man who lifted him onto his shoulders and told stories about stars. of a girl, older, louder, who tickled his feet to make him laugh. But when he tried to picture their faces, they blurred like mist on a window. "Your family is with God now," Sister Agath said one evening, noticing the way he stared into nothing. "You are safe here, Mark." But Mark didn't want safety. He wanted truth. By 1945, the war ended, but not for Mark. Victory parades meant nothing to him. He remained in the orphanage, never claimed. Many children were adopted or returned to distant relatives, but no one came for him. No name matched, no family searched. One day, an inspector from the government arrived. He wore a long grey coat and carried a stack of files. "Any unregistered orphans of Jewish descent?" he asked. The sisters shook their heads. Mark watched. From the stairs, heart pounding, he wanted to scream, to say, "I'm not Mark, I'm Emil. My mother is Miriam, my father Henry." But fear choked him. What if saying it out loud made them vanish again? Instead, he retreated into silence once more. Years passed. The boy became a teenager, then a man. He left the orphanage at 17, taking only the bear with him, now patchy and worn. In Lyon, he found work in a bakery, changed jobs often, never stayed long. Trust was foreign, roots impossible. He was a man built of fragments, and somewhere, across the ocean, a woman in Philadelphia was sorting through her late grandfather's belongings when she found an old war album from his time stationed in France. Inside, nestled between faded photos and handwritten notes, was the picture of a boy, gaunt, frightened, with large dark eyes. And underneath, written in careful Hebrew, Emil Rosenfeld, Lyon, 1943. Philadelphia, 1989. Hannah Levine sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of her grandfather's study, surrounded by boxes that smelled of mothballs, old tobacco, and time. Her grandfather, David Levine, had passed away 3 weeks earlier. A Jewish-American veteran, he had rarely spoken of the war, though medals and a folded American flag rested on the mantel in silence. As she unpacked a weathered trunk marked Europe 1943-45, Hannah's fingers brushed over yellowed maps, telegrams, and letters in Yiddish and English. Then, at the bottom of the pile, wrapped in thin waxed paper, she found an album. The cover was brown leather, scuffed at the corners. The pages inside crackled when she turned them, each filled with black and white photos, handwritten names, and places scrawled in ink. Normandy, Rennes, Bordeaux. But one photo stopped her hand. It was of a boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Thin, hollow-cheeked, wide dark eyes stared at the camera with a kind of lost wisdom. He clutched a stuffed bear, ears torn, eyes mismatched. The photo was unlike the others. Not a soldier, not a town. A child in the middle of war. Beneath it, written in her grandfather's sharp, cursive script, Emil Rosenfeld, Lyon, 1943. Hannah felt her breath catch. Rosenfeld, it wasn't a common name. Her great-grandmother's maiden name had been Rosenfeld. Could there be a connection? She turned the page, then back again. The boy's expression haunted her, as if he were trying to remember something he couldn't say. She took the photo out carefully and examined the back. More writing, faint in pencil. Orphan, delivered by McKee. Name uncertain, called Mark by nuns. Mark. Suddenly the dots began to connect. She recalled her mother once mentioning that David had spent time with the French resistance, delivering messages, helping escort Jewish families. She remembered vague stories of him hiding in a barn, of children handed off in the night like parcels. No time for goodbyes. Hannah's heart raced. She turned on her desk lamp, flipped open a notebook, and began writing. What if Emil was still alive? What if he never knew who he really was? She spent the next days combing through archives, writing to Jewish historical societies, searching every record she could. In Lyon, she contacted the orphanage that had once been a convent. Most of its records had been lost in a fire in the 1950s, but Sister Camille, now retired and in her 80s, still remembered some of the names. There was a boy, the old nun told her over the phone, in slow, accented English. We called him Mark. Silent child. Had a bear he never let go of. That detail alone made Hannah's hands tremble. Do you know what happened to him? A baker's apprentice. Last we heard, vanished after he left us. Took no name with him. Hannah felt like crying, but she didn't stop. She scanned the photo, wrote letters to Jewish organizations in Lyon and Paris, and shared the image in forums for Holocaust survivors and their descendants. The image of Emil began to circulate, small, uncertain hope moving across countries. And in a modest bakery on the outskirts of Mestua, a man in his 50s stood behind the counter, wiping flour from his hands, when a younger colleague called out, "Mark, come see this. Someone says this boy might be you." He approached slowly, half annoyed, until he saw the screen, the photo, the bear. His breath faltered. The world tilted. "Where did you find this?" He whispered, "I didn't. It found me." Marseille, 1989. Marc Delacroix had lived most of his life not knowing who he truly was. He remembered very little before the convent. Blurred images, a soft voice, humming lullabies in a language he no longer understood, the weight of arms wrapped around him, the scent of wood smoke. Then, silence. Then the convent. The nuns had found him half-conscious in the back of a truck with other children, all of them pale and silent. Some were claimed by distant relatives, others disappeared into institutions. Mark stayed. He never remembered his real name. He was given a new one, Mark, and told nothing of the world before. He grew up within the convent walls until he was old enough to be apprenticed to a baker. The work was honest, and the small bakery in Marseille became his life. He had a wife once, Claire, who died young. No children, no siblings that he knew of. His world was bred and quiet, until the day a photo cracked open his past. The email from Hannah had arrived after a series of calls and verifications. She wanted to visit, he wasn't sure. But something about the way she wrote, the urgency, the gentleness reminded him of the voice he could never place in his dreams. When Hannah arrived in Marseille, she brought the original photo with her. "This is you, isn't it?" she asked, placing the image gently on the cafe table between them. Mark stared at the photograph. I think so. I had a bare one I was missing. The nuns took it from me when I turned 7, said I had to grow up. His name was Emil, she said softly. Emil Rosenfeld. My great-grandmother was a Rosenfeld. We believe you're her nephew. My grandfather, David Levine, he took this photo. Mark's eyes filled. A strange heat bloomed in his chest. He looked at the name beneath the image again. Emil. The name tasted unfamiliar and holy. "I've never belonged to a name," he whispered. Hannah nodded. "My family wants to meet you, if you're ready." Mark's hands trembled. He'd spent a life in the shadows of war, never knowing why he was left behind. And now, pieces were finding each other. The following weeks were a blur. DNA tests confirmed it. He was Emil. His parents, Aaron and Miriam Rosenfeld, had been part of a Jewish resistance cell in Lyon. They had placed him with the Maquis to keep him safe before being captured. Neither survived, but their legacy did. Mark, now Emil once more, traveled to Philadelphia to meet the rest of his family. He was welcomed not as a stranger, but as a brother lost to time. They took him to his parents' memorial stone at the old Jewish cemetery, where he stood silently, hand pressed against the cool marble. "I don't remember their faces," he murmured, "but I remember warmth. That must have been them." After the memorial, Hannah handed him a small box. "I found this in my grandfather's trunk too. He must have kept it all these years." Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, was a worn, patched teddy bear with one eye missing. Emil gasped, This was mine." Tears spilled freely down his cheeks. The bear, battered and aged, felt like the only anchor to a life stolen and returned. For the first time in over 40 years, Emil Rosenfeld slept peacefully. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man with a name, a history, a family, and a future. Emil stood by the window of the guest room in Philadelphia, holding the bear tightly in his hands. The sky outside was a soft gray, a color that had followed him most of his life. But now, there was light seeping through it, a warmth he had never known in his youth. Over the following weeks, the Levine family helped him piece together the fragments of his stolen childhood. Old letters were translated, photos were passed around, faces of cousins, aunts, and uncles, people who had believed him dead for decades, now smiled at him from across kitchen tables and living room couches. But the question that haunted him most was this: what happened to me after they hid me? The key lay in a name. Per-Andre. Hannah had unearthed it from one of her great-grandfather's journals. It seemed the resistance had relied on a network of sympathetic priests and farmers to move Jewish children out of dangerous zones. Per-Andre had been the one assigned to Emil. Hannah and Emil traveled to Lyon, France, following faint trails of records and whispered testimonies from aging villagers. In the dusty archives of an old church near Valence, they found it, a handwritten note, child delivered by Aaron R., October 1942, sent to L'Arc du Ciel, no return scheduled. Emil's hands trembled as he traced the ink. L'Arc du Ciel, the Ark of Heaven. It was an orphanage run by nuns on the edge of the Alps. That must have been where they took me, he said, voice barely above a whisper. But I don't remember the name. They drove 3 hours to the old stone building, now abandoned and overrun with ivy. The windows were broken, but the doorway was still marked by a rusted iron cross. Inside, dust and silence greeted them like ghosts. They found the chapel, small and crumbling, and then the dormitories. In one room, a mural of painted stars still clung to the wall. I remember these, Emil said, staring up. I used to count them to fall asleep. They searched through remnants in the office, old ledgers, school reports, and finally, A-list. Names of children. And there it was. Emil Rosenfeld, age 4, arrived October 19 for 2, no departure date. It's you, Hannah whispered. Emil touched the fragile page. They erased the rest. Someone removed where I went. Maybe the priest, or maybe they thought it didn't matter anymore. They left with a copy of the list and silence between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was reverent. Back in Marseille, Emil walked the streets of his past, retracing memories that now shimmered with clarity. He visited the bakery where he once worked, spoke with neighbors who had aged alongside him, unaware of the story behind his quiet eyes. One elderly woman, Madame Fournier, stopped him outside a flower stall. "Mark," she asked gently. He smiled. "It's Emil now. I found my name." She placed a hand over her heart. "I always knew you were someone precious." He smiled through the tears. "Thank you for treating me as if I was." Later, at a quiet cafe, overlooking the port, Emil took out a notebook Hannah had gifted him and began to write his story in his words. For the children who had no voice, for the families who never stopped hoping, and for the little boy who once believed he was alone in the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and lavender, Emil Rosenfeld wrote the first words of his new life. "I was lost, but I was never forgotten." The weeks following their discovery passed in a gentle blur. Emil had returned to the United States with Hannah, but left a part of his soul resting beneath the stars painted on the orphanage ceiling in France. There was something about seeing his name written in his stranger's hand that had settled a storm he hadn't known he carried. Back in Philadelphia, a small gathering was planned at the Levine home. Word had spread among the extended family, many of whom had never heard the full story of Hannah's discovery. People came with photographs, old letters, and questions that trembled in their voices. "Did you know my grandfather? What was your favorite food back then? Do you remember the lullaby Aunt Rivka used to sing?" Emil answered as much as he could. Some memories returned like vivid paintings. Others were shadows on a wall. He had lost a language, a culture, and a family, but standing among them now, he was reclaiming all three. After the gathering, Hannah brought him a worn package. Inside was a tattered envelope, yellowed, fragile, unopened. It had been found by a cousin while clearing out an attic in Brooklyn. The front read, "To Emil, if he is ever found." Dated March 1943, signed Aaron Rosenfeld. Emil sat in silence for a long time before opening it. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper. "My son, if by some miracle you are reading this, it means you survived. And for that, I thank God. With every breath I have left, your mother and I love you beyond words. We had to let you go to give you a chance. I pray you forgive us for not being there when you needed us. I don't know what this world has become, but if you are out there, know that you were born of love, of hope, of the belief that goodness will outlast evil. Be strong, be kind, be proud of your name, your father." Aaron Emil pressed the letter to his heart. It was the only thing he had ever received directly from his father. It was a voice from the ashes, a thread through time. He read the letter again and again, then carefully folded it and placed it in the notebook with his own writings. That night, he couldn't sleep. Instead, he walked the streets of the neighborhood, letting the cool air ground him. He passed playgrounds filled with laughter, cafes lit with warm light, and families dining together through open windows. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything: grief, relief, love, longing. he reached a small Jewish cemetery tucked behind a synagogue. He didn't know if any of his family rested there, but he sat beside a modest gravestone anyway, and whispered a prayer, half in English, half in broken Hebrew he had practiced since returning. "I found you," he said softly. "You didn't die in vain." A breeze stirred through the trees. In that moment, he didn't feel alone. 2 years had passed since Emil first saw his name printed in that war album in Lyon. Since then, he had slowly rebuilt a life that once felt like a ghost's memory. His once broken past had become part of his present, no longer a secret locked away in shadows, but a history embraced, told, and honored. With Hannah's encouragement, he began speaking at schools and museums, sharing what little he remembered and much of what he had learned. He talked about the train station, the orphanage ceiling, the smell of boiled cabbage, and the fear in his mother's eyes. Each time, he ended his story not with tragedy, but with the letter from Erin, the one his father had written without ever knowing if his son would read it. One autumn afternoon, Emil received an invitation from a Holocaust Memorial Center. In Washington, D.C. They had heard about his story and asked if he would allow the letter and his family's documents to become part of a permanent exhibit. Emil hesitated, not because he was unwilling, but because parting with the letter felt like letting go of a lifeline. That night, he reread the letter once more. He whispered each word aloud in the quiet of his living room, as if reading it back to his father. And then, with trembling hands, he signed the release form. Weeks later, he stood in the center's Hall of Memory, staring at a glass case. Inside, surrounded by soft lights and gentle shadows, lay his father's letter, the black and white photograph of a boy in a wool coat, and the war album with the inscription, Emil Rosenfeld, age 5, status unknown. But now, the plaque beneath had been changed. Status, survivor. Visitors came and went. Some read the captions, others wiped silent tears, and one little girl, no older than Emil had been in 1942, stared at the photo for a long time, her hand pressed to the glass. "Is that you?" she asked softly when Emil walked by. He nodded. It was. The girl turned to him with wide eyes. "But you're here now." "Yes," he smiled. "I am." It was a moment Emil would carry for the rest of his days. Later that evening, he sat beside Hannah on the steps of the center. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the marble. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if you hadn't gone to Lyon with me that day?" Emil looked at her, his eyes full of depth and softness. "I would have never known who I was," he said. "I would have never known who I came from. And now, he said, "I'm not just a man without a past. I'm a son, a survivor, a witness." A breeze stirred the leaves around them. Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence as dusk swallowed the city. That night, Emil began writing a new letter, not to his father, but to his future grandchildren, to the ones who might never understand what war takes from a child or how love can reach across decades. He wrote of courage, of pain, of memory, and of how sometimes, even after a life scattered by war, one's name can still be found and spoken and remembered. Years later, Emil's letter to his future grandchildren became part of the same exhibit that once showcased his father's words. It sat framed beside his childhood photo, 2 generations of voices finally heard, finally honored. He lived a quiet but meaningful life, always carrying a worn copy of the album that had changed everything. In classrooms, community halls, and even quiet family dinners, he would remind others that history isn't just about the wars fought, it's about the people lost, found, and remembered. His story traveled farther than he ever expected. Across borders and languages, it became a symbol not only of survival, but of rediscovery. That a name written down and nearly forgotten could one day echo loud enough to rebuild a broken life. And though Emil eventually passed, his legacy remained not as a lost child of war, but as a voice that broke through silence, a memory that would never again be buried beneath the rubble. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor the countless others whose names were nearly lost to time. Leave a comment below, sharing what part touched you most. Give this video a like, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories, because every forgotten name deserves to be remembered.